In the last video, we were talking about an ecological niche and how an organism can live in an ecosystem, but the specific environmental requirements that that organism needs to survive, to grow, and to be surviving efficiently enough to be able to actually get enough resources to then go and reproduce, those are a lot more restrictive than you might expect. So only certain parts of the ecosystem are going to be the specific habitat that you find that organism in. And every organism has a job in their ecosystem. They're a decomposer, they're a producer, they're a herbivore, they're a carnivore, something along those lines. So the particular locations where you can find a organism in an ecosystem and the particular job that they do in that location is their niche. It's the role that they fulfill in that ecosystem. And as long as there is an organism that fulfills that job in that portion of the ecosystem, and you have at least one species that's doing every job in every location in the ecosystem, that ecosystem is going to be functional. Now, ideally, you would want multiple species that could potentially do any given job in any given niche. That would mean that if you lost any one species, other species would be able to fill in. In order for that to happen, though, niches would need to be able to overlap each other. You would need organisms with similar environmental requirements. However, whenever niches overlap, you get competition. You get competition for resources, and competition reduces fitness because you have to waste time competing for resources, and therefore you're not gathering food, you're not growing, you're not reproducing, you're spending extra effort in order to just get the basics that you need to survive. So competition is bad for evolutionary fitness. There's two strategies that organisms employ in order to avoid competition. One is to become a specialist species, and this is what giant pandas do. Specialist species have narrow niches. They limit the types of resources that they consume, and they limit the environmental requirements that they utilize so that they only exist in very specific types of habitats and use very specific types of resources. And they become the best at using that particular niche such that they can outcompete anything in that particular niche. Right? If anything else tries to move in, the giant pandas are going to outclass them at every turn. In this case, eating bamboo in the mountaintops of the Chinese rural areas. By constricting their niche, they eliminate as much overlap with other types of species as possible. They're really just focusing on what they can become good at. And this is a pretty profound adaptation because bears are an omnivorous group, generally speaking, but pandas have become an herbivorous species. They just eat bamboo. They eat different types of bamboo at different points of the year. They move up and down the mountainside. They eat it at different growth stages in order to try to get all of their nutrients. But they need to eat a lot of bamboo in order to sustain their biomass, in order to get enough calories, in order to build themselves up. So this is a very, very specialist diet, and the giant pandas in these areas have a very important role in the ecosystem of keeping the growth of bamboo down, because bamboo, if you've ever had some growing in your backyard, you know that it will grow and grow and grow, and it'll outcompete all of the other plants in that area, right? You'll get nothing but bamboo if it's not kept down. So having giant pandas in these areas will actually make the plant populations, the plant community, I should say, in that location more biodiverse because you have this herbivore that's making sure that the bamboo population is kept in check. So that's a specialist species, one with a narrow niche to reduce niche overlap with other types of species that might be competitors. The other way that you can avoid competition is actually to go the complete opposite route. Become a generalist species. Make your niche as broad as it can possibly be. You can exist in many, many, many different environmental requirements, right? It can be really cold or it can be pretty hot, but you can adapt to either of those situations. Lots of sunlight, a little bit of sunlight. You're happy to have pristine water, but if the water's a little bit nasty, you're kind of okay with that as well. You can eat plants, you can eat meat, you can eat rotting carcasses, you can hunt a little bit. You have all kinds of different options available to you. And that means that if you have intense competition for one particular resource in one particular location, that's okay. You have lots of other options. You can just move on to something else. So generalist species avoid competition by keeping their options open. They can go lots of different places, they can go and move into lots of different niches, and if they have a lot of competition one place, they just go someplace else. So a raccoon is a really good example of a generalist species. They are omnivorous, they can eat all kinds of different food, they can eat plants, they can eat meat, they can eat material they just found kind of lying around. That's why they're always going through garbage cans and things like that. They can climb up in trees, or they can live down on the ground. They can live in cities. They can live in forests. They can live in suburban areas. Wherever raccoons are found, they are going to do fairly well for themselves because they will make do with whatever you give them. That is a generalist species. Now, there are downsides to both of these strategies. If you're a generalist species, yeah, you have a broad niche and you have lots of options. However, every resource that you would like to gather for yourself, any kind of plant matter that you would like to consume, or any kind of animal that you would like to hunt, or depending on what resource we're talking about or what particular organism we're discussing, any resource that you would like to gather for yourself, it's almost a guarantee that there is some specialist species that is better at gathering that resource than you are. So with a broad niche, you probably overlap not with one species, but possibly dozens of different species. So you're going to be competing for resources with lots of different organisms. You have different options, so you can find the one where you have the least competition and focus on that. But you are definitely going to be competing because you're not the best at exploiting any one of these resources. You're a generalist. You gotta look around for your options. If you're a specialist species, you are probably the best at competing for one particular resource, but then you are tied to that resource. Your fate is kind of tied to the existence of that resource. So if something happens where, say, the bamboo in China starts getting depleted, or where development comes through and the bamboo forests get cleared away, habitat destruction, then there's not going to be any bamboo left for these pandas to eat. And as a result, they're not going to be able to get calories in their diet. That's the only food that they can really exploit. So their population will start to plummet. And that is a big reason why giant pandas went onto the endangered species list, was habitat destruction and basically an inability to adapt to other types of resources, other types of environments. They were specialists for the locations where they were found. So while specialists might be the best competitors for a given resource or a given niche, they are more vulnerable to extinctions than generalists would be, because generalists can spread all over the place. And if they are found over a wide area, it's much less likely that the loss of any one environment or any one food resource or any one thing is going to completely eliminate that species. In other words, raccoons are in no risk of becoming extinct anytime in the near future. Now, in the evolution video, I talked about how traits arise from mutations in DNA. So you get this kind of random generation of traits, and only those traits that are useful for survival and reproduction are the ones that will show up in subsequent generations, because the more you reproduce, the more of your genes will end up in the next generation's gene pool. So only the ones useful for reproduction show up generation by generation by generation. And that seems almost like it would be a random process, right? Random mutations, and then we see which ones are useful for reproduction, and those are the ones that are represented. But although randomness is at the heart of evolution, the traits which are useful for exploiting a particular niche are actually pretty consistent from continent to continent, from ecosystem to ecosystem. So frequently we find situations where two organisms, two completely separate branches of the tree of life, have independently developed similar traits, similar mutations led to similar physical characteristics, totally separately from each other. Like they didn't inherit these from a common ancestor. because they are fulfilling the same role in their ecosystem. So here I have a European wolf. You guys are familiar with this basic body shape with the elongated snout, with the sharp teeth, the front-facing triangular ears, the eyes which are pitched forward here so that it can see the prey that's right in front of it, whereas if you are a prey species, typically the eyes are a little bit closer to the sides of the head, so you have a wider field of view to avoid predators. The powerful running legs in order to be able to chase down prey, right? Classic wolf shape. Well, here we have what's called a Tasmanian wolf on the left. This is an extinct species, but pretty recently extinct. Like, you can see that I have video of it right here, black and white video. They're also called a thylacine, and this was found in Australia, and it's a marsupial. So this is more closely related to kangaroos and koalas and wombats than it is to our wolf over here, right? It shares more recent common ancestry with a koala bear than it does with a wolf, and yet look at it. It looks like a wolf, right? It's got those same kinds of ears, those same powerful running legs. It's got the elongated snout with the sharp teeth and the eyes. Even the tail has some similarities to it. And that's because Australia had an ecological niche available for a carnivorous predator to hunt down the various marsupials and other small mammals and birds that were part of the Australian ecosystem. So some organism evolved to fulfill that niche. And it turns out that these features are just fundamentally useful for that task. So we see these show up in the wolf, and then we saw them show up again in the Tasmanian wolf, the thylacine. Up until settlers started coming to Australia, Australia didn't have any placental mammals. It was just marsupials in terms of mammals on Australia. So things like wolves didn't exist on Australia. This is why a marsupial had to evolve in order. I should put one qualifying note in there. There were bats in Australia, so there was one kind of placental mammal. But apart from that, it was all marsupials in terms of mammals, which is why a marsupial had to evolve to become a predator. It's just so weird. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I find it so weird to talk about a marsupial predator because you're so used to thinking of koalas and kangaroos, and the idea that there was this large predatory marsupial is just wild to me. So we call these ecological equivalents. Both of these organisms fulfill a similar niche in their respective habitats. They do the same kind of job. And because they occupy a similar niche in their respective locations, plants and animals in similar habitats often develop similar features or behaviors, even when they are entirely unrelated species living on different continents. When I say entirely unrelated, I mean they develop these features and behaviors separately from one another. They're not coming from a common ancestry. All life on Earth is fundamentally related to each other, but these traits are showing up on separate branches of the tree of life. An example that might be helpful to think about is wings. Insect wings help flight, bird wings help flight, bat wings help flight, but they did not all come from a single common ancestor. All of these different versions of wings independently showed up in evolutionary history. They're not related to each other, even though all animals are fundamentally related to each other in terms of evolutionary history. These wings showed up completely separately. On the following slide, we have some more examples of ecological equivalents that occur on different continents or widely different locations, but because they fulfill a similar niche in their respective ecosystems, they've developed similar physical characteristics. So we have a cactus on the left, which you find in the United States, and it's a succulent plant, holds a lot of water, and has these thick spines, or these sharp spines on it, I should say, in order to ward off predators, herbivores, and things like that from bothering it too much. On the right, we have Euphorbius, which you find in Asia and Africa, and they're another family of thick, succulent plants with spines on them that you also find in desert-like conditions, and they're fulfilling the same ecological niche as cacti are but they've developed these traits entirely separately. They are different groups of plants. Down here, we have a blue whale, one of the largest animals on the planet, or the largest animal on the planet. It's a mammal. You guys probably know that. The whales are mammals, not fish. It's 98 feet long. It has no teeth. It's got baleen, and it pushes water through that baleen in order to strain out plankton. So it's a plankton feeding, filter feeder type mammal. And on the right, we have a whale shark, which is a fish, which is about 43 feet long, so it's a little bit shorter, but it's still a massive, massive animal. And it is also a filter feeder of plankton. It uses a slightly different filtering mechanism, but it's also a plankton filter feeder type animal. The first example we had of ecological equivalence was a wolf and a thylacine, right? A marsupial and a placental mammal. Then we had two different plants, cacti and euphorbias. So, all right, these are pretty closely related organisms. I can see how they would be able to develop similar characteristics. But here we have a mammal and a fish. These two organisms are as distantly related from each other as you are from a goldfish. In fact, the common ancestor that you share with a goldfish is going to be the same common ancestor that the whale shares with the whale shark. That's how far apart in evolutionary history these two organisms would be. And yet they developed very, very similar physical and behavioral characteristics because there's an open job available, plankton feeding. And there are certain characteristics that make you a good plankton feeder in this ecosystem. So they developed the traits that made them the most fit competitors in that ecosystem, in that niche, were what they developed to fulfill. So the niche and the concept of competition is deeply involved in how evolution works. Evolution is built on mutation. Mutation is how you get new traits, how we randomly shuffle around genes and get new types of things added into the mix. But natural selection, right, what traits actually work, that has a lot to do with niches and competition and ecology. And it is decidedly non-random. One more good ecological equivalent, another marsupial and placental mammal pairing. So these two are as distantly related as the thylacine and the wolf are. Again, they would share the same common ancestor, actually, as the thylacine and the wolf do, because it would be the same common ancestor of all marsupials and placental mammals. We have two tree-dwelling primary consumers that spend most of their day sleeping. One found only on Australia, the other found only in South America. So even though they are found in completely different locations, completely different ecosystems, those ecosystems are similar enough to have niches available that an organism would develop similar traits to fulfill those roles. Okay, so let's apply this idea a little bit. If ecological equivalents are two separate species that have very, very similar niches, similar environmental requirements, similar jobs in an ecosystem, similar types of resources that they exploit, what would happen if we took one species from an ecosystem and we transplanted it into another ecosystem where there was already another species that was its ecological equivalent? So we have two of these ecological equivalents directly in interaction with each other. What do you think would occur then? Pause the video, think about everything you know about what happens when two niches overlap each other, and then come up with a prediction. It doesn't have to be a very long prediction. Think of a couple sentences of, oh, this would happen, and maybe then this would happen. What would transpire in that situation? Okay, so if we were to take a species from one location and transplant it to another location, and we knew that there was an ecological equivalent in that location, well, if if ecological equivalents are two species that have very similar environmental requirements, that probably means that our transplanted species is going to be able to do quite well for itself. That's going to be able to survive in those conditions. And if they exploit similar types of resources in their environment, it'll probably be able to find food resources for itself. And in fact, what we're saying with ecological equivalence is they're two organisms with virtually the same niche. But if they are found in the same location, that means that the niches are going to overlap very, very strongly. And remember what we talked about with those Paramecia species, with G.F. Gauss, competitive exclusion. If you have two complete competitors, one of those organisms is going to outcompete the other one and drive it to extinction. So the more completely two niches overlap each other, the more perfectly they fit on top of each other, the more strongly those two organisms are going to compete. Competition is a negative interaction. It reduces both organisms' fitness, but whichever one is the stronger competitor is going to drive the other to extinction. And this is what we call an invasive species. When it's almost a paradox, but adding a species to an ecosystem can sometimes decrease the overall biodiversity of that ecosystem because you're driving other species to extinction. So we have to be very careful when we're moving species around because we might introduce something that will actually thrive in that ecosystem. Just because it's not from there doesn't mean it won't do exceptionally well in that location. And when one species population skyrockets, other species populations might plummet as a result. So if you were to take a poison dart frog from Madagascar and transplant it to South America or vice versa, they could become an invasive species in either of those locations. We'll talk more about invasive species and some very specific case studies with invasive species later on, because they're honestly some of the most interesting stories in ecology. I love talking about invasive species. They're a horrible problem, but they're really interesting to talk about. But this is all related to competition, and we said that there's multiple different ways that two different species can interact. Competition was just one of them. So now we're going to talk about other ways that two species can interact in the next couple of videos.